A free thinker. Do not ask me who I am. I am no doubt not the only one who writes in order to have no face. Do not ask me who I am, and do not ask me to remain the same. Leave it to our bureaucrats and our police to see that our papers are in order. Michel Foucault, The Archaeology of Knowledge. Objective proximity is not conducive to objective perception and appreciation, and I am far from sure that in matters of knowledge there is such a thing as the privileged view of the compatriot, the contemporary, the fellow student and colleague. French, a student at the École Normale in the late 1940s when existentialism was at its apogee, an agrégé in philosophy. Michel Foucault owed to this historical location his starting points and reference points, his intellectual landmarks, his refusals and his phobias, everything that combines to constitute an intellectual project. With a few years' difference, I share with him all these determinant properties and many others which follow from them, particularly in our vision of the intellectual world. It is no accident that we so often found ourselves in the same camp, allied against the same adversaries, sometimes attacked indifferently by the same enemies. And so my attempt to contribute to an accurate understanding of Michel Foucault and his work by sketching an intellectual history of the universe in which and against which his thought took shape runs the risk of fictitious assimilation or dissimilation, each of which, in the case of a famous thinker, offers considerable symbolic profits. However, the intention is justified, I think, in the case of an intellectual who, like Michel Foucault, constantly strove to break with the narcissistic complacency of the prophetic intellectual in order to seek to know himself, not in his singularity, but in his generic features, the unthought that defines the thinker. In one of our last conversations, in which we had recalled for each other at some length some decisive turning points in our intellectual itineraries, we decided to conduct dialogues with a mutual friend, in which, as honestly and objectively as possible, we would make explicit the whole inseparably social and intellectual substratum of an enterprise of thought. Decisive encounters, books that set us thinking, refusals that were starting points, exemplary figures, things that are entirely personal, often carefully hidden, even from intimates, and which we thought it right to declare, to make public, as a contribution to the intellectual work of clarifying intellectual work, and this in spite of our shared repugnance of all forms of personal confession. Without presuming to offer my intuition of what might be the central intuition of Foucault's work, in one of those bids for appropriation to which all great oeuvres are subject, I would like to help to protect him against reduction to any of his classificatory properties, by recalling the almost visceral anticonformism, the restive impatience with all categorization and classification, which define Michel Foucault. Historian of knowledge, historian of science, historian of the social sciences, social scientist, philosopher, philosopher of history, philosopher of the history of science. None of these over-restrictive labels adequately defines him. To point to his relationship to Marxism or the French tradition in epistemology, Bachelard, Canguilhem, in history of philosophy or history of science, Gueroult, Vuillemin, structural anthropology or history, Lévi-Strauss, Dumézil, or to Nietzsche, Artaud, or Bataille, is not to reduce him to sources or influences, but to offer the means of grasping the distances through which he constructed himself. It is not to put him away, to confine him in a classificatory prison, but to enable him to escape, as he always did and as he would if he were still alive. It is to defend against the classifiers, the bureaucrats of thought. Is Foucault Marxist or anti-Marxist? Is he really a philosopher? A thinker who strove, with his utmost energy and to the last moment, to explore the intellectual and social limits of his thought, to distance himself from himself and his own thought, and from the social image of his own thought. One could begin with the relationship to Marx, and show how this attempt to pose the problem of knowledge in materialist terms, one of the possible partial definitions of Foucault's project, cannot be reduced to the either-or of Marxism and anti-Marxism, that it is neither of them and both of them at the same time. When Foucault did quote Marx, when he borrowed phrases or concepts, he never did so in the way expected of someone who wants to be regarded as Marxist, i.e., as one who reveres Marx and who is celebrated in the Marxist newspapers and journals. In the logic of devotion, the most decisive quotations and references are the most gratuitous ones, the ones that visibly are only there to render the faith visible, to profess and proclaim it. In place of a theoretical oblation, Foucault preferred the discreet, even secret, homage implied by use, implementation. This crypto aspect. Could he be ashamed of Marx, of calling himself a Marxist, to make such use of Marx without admitting it? And is this closet Marxism still Marxist? His conspicuous distance from the ritual of the ordinary cult, to which the Althusserians have given intellectual legitimacy, his way of making Marx an author like others. Such behavior disconcerted and even worried the faithful. It was the same with the philosophers. The same Foucault who associated the determination of his intellectual project with the real discovery of Nietzsche wrote somewhere that the only way to pay homage to thinkers like Nietzsche was to utilize them, to make some use of them, even one that distorts them, even if it outraged the commentators. This liberated relationship to classificatory identities is not self-evident. One only has to remember Sartre consecrating Marxism as the unsupersedable philosophy of our time, and the intellectual profits which follow are not without social losses and costs. And vice versa, of course. Consider all those who live and have lived on the dividends guaranteed to the legitimate inheritors of the symbolic authority of the day. Marx, of course, but also, within the confines of the universities, Kant, Heidegger, or more minor masters. At the risk of seeming inconsequential, I will here mention Foucault's relation to politics, a dimension of the same deep-rooted posture, and his horror of all forms of the political Pharisaism which, often at little cost, secures the profits attached to defending good causes. There are people, even among intellectuals, for whom it is easier to say they are on the left when the left is in power. For Michel Foucault and a few others, it is harder, if not impossible. And this outraged the opportunists, who denounced the silence of the intellectuals. But it is to Foucault's oeuvre that one must turn for the dialogue with Marx, and secondarily with the Marxists, that is never absent from any work of social science. In Madness and Civilization, The History of Insanity in the Age of Reason, and in The Birth of the Clinic, Foucault explicitly relates the confinement of the insane in asylums and of the poor in hospitals to a theory of the relations of production and the political economy of poverty. The insane require special treatment because they are the most radically unproductive members of the population. Likewise, at the beginning of the liberal era, the hospital and the clinical gaze arose from the use value of the bodies of the poor. Quote, "These, then, were the terms of the contract by which wealth and poverty participated in the organization of clinical experience. In a regime of economic freedom, the hospital had found a way of interesting the rich. The clinic constitutes the progressive reversion of the other contracting party. It is the interest paid by the poor on the capital that the rich have consented to invest in the hospital." End quote. The euphemization introduced by the preciosity of the style does not entirely mask a fairly brutal form of economism. The hospital is the site of an unequal exchange, relief given to suffering in exchange for a clinical gaze on the body presented as a spectacle. In Discipline and Punish, Foucault explicitly invokes the Marxist analysis of constant capital and variable capital to explain the modern prison as an instrument of disciplinary power and links the accumulation of men with the accumulation of capital. In The History of Sexuality, he relates the disciplining and regulation of sexuality to the demands of production, seeing power over bodies as one of the conditions of economic development and capitalist accumulation. One could multiply the examples of texts which, both in their mode of thought and in their language, have a strongly Marxist ring to them. The emergence of the political in its pure form, with the concept of power knowledge, might thus be seen as a radical break with the Marxist theory of domination, and with the economism which makes ownership of the means of production the sole or main principle of domination. Power comes from below. It is no longer situated in a central site, but is discovered everywhere, that is to say, everywhere where it is, in families, in small groups, in discourse, in institutions. This discovery, and Michel Foucault himself would not have denied this, is not unconnected with the social experimentation that was constituted by the movement of May 1968. The moral discipline of confinement, more so than was said in the History of Madness, had to do with disciplinary codes and with discourse. But in fact, long before Discipline and Punish, and probably from the very beginning, Foucault had broken with the architectural theory of hierarchized instances which the Althusserians so strongly reactivated, and which dominated all the thinking of the Annales school. From the analysis of psychiatric interment to the analysis of the normalization of sexuality, it is always a question of showing, inter alia, that phenomena which are of little consequence for someone who adopts a solely economic standpoint play an essential role in the maintenance of political order, and that this might be the best hidden and most decisive condition of the economic order. Knowledge is an instrument of power, a social technology. Repression and prohibition, exclusion and rejection, are so many cognitive operations of classification which place individuals under surveillance. Libido siendi is a libido dominandi, which, as is seen in the case of the clinic, proceeds in the irreproachable guise of a will to knowledge. In treating the scientific history of knowledge as a dimension of political science, Foucault radically transforms even the newest and most specific aspects of Bachelard's or Canguilhem's work. Each had sought in the history of error or false science. See, for example, Canguilhem's Idéologie et rationalité dans la science de la vie, 1977, the truth of scientific labor, which the Kantian type of reflection on already accomplished, finished science cannot reveal. Science, in the sense of a knowledge power, is always open to the temptation of error, which arises from a will to knowledge charged with a will to power. Never is this more clearly seen than in the case of the social sciences, especially in the nascent stage from which they are still struggling to emerge, and for good reason. In clinical medicine and psychopathology, law and political science, Foucault was studying sciences in which the frontier between truth and error is weakest, those which are most charged with ideology, because the political stakes they deal in are infinitely more vital than those of the natural sciences. In concentrating on areas abandoned by the historians, the hospital, the prison, or the confessional, and on those anti-heroes who are called the outcasts of society, the criminal, the hermaphrodite, or the wolf child, Foucault strove to uncover the unthought of normal science. This project logically culminates in a social history of social science, which is knowledge power, par excellence. It is at this point that we see emerging the critical project, critical in Kant's sense, and Foucault translated Kant's anthropology into French, which guides the whole enterprise. The critique of anthropology is performed in the analysis of the social and logical conditions which make possible the science of man by man, i.e., in the history of the historical invention of man. The historical genealogy which breaks with the anthropocentrism of classical philosophy in order to reconstitute the social genesis of modern man achieves in quite different ways the Kantian ambition of knowing the capacity to know, i.e., the inseparably political and cognitive technologies, the disciplines whose emergence is contemporaneous with industrialization and which functioned, in reformist guise, as instruments of policing and politics, as rules of knowledge and rules for living, psychology, clinical medicine, the social sciences, criminology, population theory, psychopathology, political economy, psychoanalysis, psychiatry. The medical gaze, an exemplary figure, is structured not only by the system of knowledge it implements, but also by the social relationship of domination within which it operates. There is a political history of the production of truth. This social history of the production of man by man, which occurs through the struggle to produce the truth about man, is a form, if not the form par excellence, of self-knowledge. And the genealogy of knowledge finds its logical extension in a genealogy of morals. On the one hand, exploring the social limits of the knowledge, or, which amounts to the same thing, the social conditions of possibility of the knowledge, particularly of the social world, that we derive from knowledge powers and disciplines. On the other, exploring the social limits of morality, the historical genesis of the subject that the anthropocentrism of classical philosophy accepted as an absolute beginning. These are two realizations of the same critical intention. In both cases, reflection on the limit leads to reflection on the limits of reflection. Power, in other words, politics, is not absent even from the relationship that might seem to be the most intimate, the freest from constraint and social control, namely reflexive self-knowledge. The knowledge-power concept was meant to serve as a reminder that knowledge is in power, and power is in knowledge. This is true even of self-knowledge. To destroy anthropocentrism is to know and recognize the anthropological limit, and to refuse to project man into the empty space left by the dead gods, as Sartre does in an exemplary way, seeking to restore to man the power to create values and truths which Descartes bestowed on God. The history of sexuality writes the history of the genesis of consciousness, of the subject, as the self-consciousness of desire. An unhappy conscience, self-concern, le souci de soi, is first of all an ethical concern, which is constituted in antiquity around the privileged question. Why is it privileged? Of sexuality, and which culminates with Christianity. Sex is the product of a history in the course of which the body is divided against itself by the perverted self-knowledge it is offered by normalizing discourse. Hysteria, onanism, fetishism, and coitus interruptus are the four exemplary figures of the reign of the political norm over the intimacy of bodies. Subjectivity is the daughter of the confessor, which perhaps explains the fascination that the new science of man, associated with Lévi-Strauss, which abolished the subject, exerted on a whole generation sated with personalist fatuity. This subject, which traditional philosophy placed at the beginning, is the product of subjection. Like sexuality, it is born of the internalization of the limits, whether accepted or transgressed, whose genesis was traced in the history of the disciplines. The critical project, the historical genealogy of the subjected subject, is inseparably a scientific and a political project. Anthropological knowledge is perhaps the only chance we have of rousing ourselves from anthropological slumber, and all the forms of self-satisfaction arising from self-concern, of breaking free of the limits inherent in the illusion of thought without historical limits, thought without any unthought. In a word, of producing a subject of which we are, in any degree, the subjects. Theory, the vision which reveals, which uncovers power, is a practice, and a political practice. It does not claim to say everything, the total truth about everything. It smokes out power where, often, it is best hidden, in the most innocuous-seeming trivia of the taken for granted. Rejecting the representation, characteristic of Homo academicus, and especially of the academic philosopher, which leads one to divide life into two realms, that of knowledge, in which rigor is invested, and that of politics, in which passion, preferably generous, is invested. Michel Foucault conceived intellectual activity as the form par excellence of a political enterprise of liberation. The politics of truth, which is the specific function of the intellectual, is carried on through the work of discovering and declaring the truth of politics. This is what makes the perverse desire to know the truth of power an irreducible adversary of the desire for power. Pierre Bourdieu, Collège de France, translated by Richard Nice.